Well, I want to start this morning by thanking the elders for the opportunity to teach this class on Jonah. Mr. Bain asked me a couple weeks ago if I would teach the class, and my immediate reaction was absolutely not. There are so many men that are much more qualified to be up here teaching this than I am, but I'm trying to look at it as a learning opportunity, and so I'm going to need lots of help this morning. I'm going to need lots of comments, so please feel free to interrupt. I'm not used to looking out at y'all, so if I don't see you, holler at me, something. I am happy to let y'all talk, so just get my attention. But on to Jonah. Jonah is a short book of only 4 chapters, and in it we find the story of one of the most well-known prophets. Any small kid in Bible class has probably heard the story about Jonah and the big fish, and they can probably tell you all of it. But in this class, we're going to discuss the whole story of Jonah, not just the big fish part. This is one of the only books of the prophets that does not actually contain a prophecy per se. It's mainly a narrative of Jonah's interaction with God and then the people of Nineveh. The story of Jonah falls fairly neatly into 4 sections, each a chapter. Chapter 1, Jonah runs away from God. Chapter 2, Jonah runs back to God. Chapter 3, Jonah runs with God. And then chapter 4, Jonah runs his own way. We're going to attempt to cover chapter 1 and chapter 2 this week, and then chapter 3 and chapter 4 next week. But before we begin in Jonah, I'd like you to turn to 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 23 through 25. Can I get a volunteer to read that passage, please? Yes, sir. 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 23 through 25. And I'm going to ask for multiple readers this morning, so if you got your glasses, I might point on you.
2 Kings 14, verses 23 through 25. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria. And he reigned 41 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo-Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was from Gath-Hepher.
Thank you. This tells us that Jonah prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam II, which was approximately between 793 and 753 BC. It's not known who actually recorded the story of Jonah, but it's generally attributed to Jonah himself. We also learn that Jonah is from Gath-Hepher, which is located inside the boundary of the tribe of Zebulun, and it's slightly northeast of Nazareth. The name Jonah means dove. Doves are typically associated with peace and purity, but it can also be associated with silliness. And sadly, I believe that's the case with our Jonah. Someone turn to Hosea chapter 7, verse 11 for me, please. Hosea 7:11. When you got it, raise your hand. Somebody read that for me, please. Mr. Britton.
Ephraim also is like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria.
As we go through this book, we're going to discuss multiple silly decisions that Jonah makes that I believe, unfortunately, fits him with the silly descriptor instead of the peaceful and pure one. Interestingly enough, many people deny that Jonah's story happened. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through 40. Matthew 12, 38 through 40. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus actually referred to Jonah in his story of being in the fish. So to state that it didn't happen is in direct contrast to Jesus teaching himself. Also, interestingly enough, this is the only location in the New Testament where Jesus directly compares himself to an Old Testament prophet. Sometimes Jonah has been referred to as a forerunner for the current Gospels, and the word was spread to non-Jews in Nineveh who were repented and they were saved from destruction. But let's go ahead and get started reading in chapter 1. Can I get a volunteer to read the first 6 verses of Jonah chapter 1? Not everybody at once. Yes, sir.
Jonah 1, 1 through 6. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it, to go with them to Tarshish away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it from them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came to him and said, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish.
It wasn't obvious before. This is the part where Jonah runs away, or at least he tries to. Jonah has been, after being told to go to Nineveh, which at this point in time was the capital of Assyria, is about 500 miles away from where he's from in Gath-Hepher. He instead decides to go down to Joppa, which is about approximately 50 miles, and get on a ship bound for Tarshish. Tarshish is somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 miles away. Nobody's exactly sure where Tarshish is, but the historians typically believe that it is on the southern coast of Spain. So in Jonah's mind, he's not only going away from Nineveh, he's going as far in the opposite direction as he can possibly go to the edge of the known world at that time. Here Jonah shows a common weakness and a foolishness in thinking that he could escape from the presence of the Lord. Can you believe the hubris of this action? God has asked him to go to Nineveh to try and preach and save that city from destruction. And instead of saying, okay, God, I'll do exactly what you say, let's go attempt to save these people, Jonah's in his mind thinking, if I go, all these people are going to be saved. Every one of them. Why would I want to save this city? Nineveh and the Assyrians have a reputation with the Israelites as a brutal enemy. And at this point in time, they've become so wicked that God's ready to destroy them. But instead of extending the olive branch, Jonah says, no way, not me, I'm not going, God. And he goes as far in the opposite direction as he could possibly go. But in verse 4, as we note, Jonah learns the hard way. It's impossible to flee from God. I want you to look at verse 4 and I want to acknowledge God's control. He already knows what's going to happen with the ship. He knows what the mariners are going to do, what they're going to try, and yet he has complete control over the entire situation. He sends the winds and the waves to push the ship right to the very edge of destruction. But he doesn't harm anyone on board, especially Jonah, who he has plans for. I also want to notice that while this is happening, and while these foreigners were in the midst of the storm, they were praying to their gods. But what else were they doing during this time? What else were they doing while they were praying and fighting the storm? Anybody? Exactly. They were trying to lighten the ship. They were throwing anything and everything they could overboard. Anything that wasn't useful. This is an excellent example to us today. Some say that God will take care of us whether we do anything or not. These men were the example of quite the opposite. They were praying, but they were doing everything they possibly could to save their own skins. This was most likely a trade vessel going from Joppa towards Tarshish. They probably had multiple items on there to trade, to sell, to barter with, things that were likely quite valuable. And these men did not care. They were throwing everything and anything that they could not use overboard in an effort to save themselves. And we must take that example and know that we can't just assume God's going to do all the work. We've got to do our part as well. So, in verse 6, the captain finds Jonah, and he's surprised at Jonah's complete unconcern. What's he doing? What's Jonah doing? Exactly, he's sleeping. How he slept through this, I don't know. If you read the description here, I don't see how anybody could be asleep during this storm, but Jonah was. And what does the captain do? He immediately calls on him to pray to God. His God is what he states. Pray to your God, stating that perhaps God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. This is how dire the situation is for this crew right now. The captain himself, who's probably the busiest guy on the ship trying to save everyone and save the ship, has sought Jonah out and said, man, you got to pray to your gods too. Ours aren't working. Something's got to give, and you're not doing your part. So wake up and start praying, because we need all the help we can get. And before we move on to the next section, does anybody have any comments on the first? Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting here to contrast the approach from Jonah and the rest of the ship. I mean, he's on the boat fleeing the presence. Their immediate reaction is to acknowledge, hey, something else is going on here. There's some God, there's some force at work here. And they immediately acknowledge the presence of something and praying to that God, and then go and again, the contrast, he's asleep.
Yeah.
He's still ignoring the presence. And this whole first part to me is really just to kind of illustrate for Jonah and for us that, to your point earlier, God's in control. God's there. God's present, and he's got to acknowledge that first.
Yes, sir.
We can think about Jonah's state of mind. He knows in his own heart that he's going the wrong direction from God. I suspect, others have suggested, he's got a lot of stress in his heart. He's got a lot of burden that he's carrying psychologically. And I think it's been noted that when a person is under a lot of psychological strain, not really in control of their situation, sometimes as a release or as a protection, you just go take a nap. And you can find yourself knowing that you don't know anything to do. I don't know anything to do with this situation except I need some release. And you can find yourself going to sleep just under pressure. It might be a statement here of what Jonah's state of mind is, what his heart is like.
Could be. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. If not, can I have a volunteer to read Jonah 1, 7 through 11, please? Randy?
Seven through 11. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and what people are you? And he said to them, I am Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, What is this that you have done? For the men knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, What shall we do to you? The sea may be quiet down for us. For the sea grew more and more tempestuous.
And then can I get another volunteer to finish the chapter 12 through 17, please? Cassie. Up here.
He said to them, Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done it as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows.
17. You're good.
Drop down a bit there. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights.
Thank you both. So, going back to verse 7, nothing is said whether or not Jonah prayed in this situation, but to me, the implication is that he did not. Jonah knew he was the reason for the storm. He knew that it was his error in trying to run from the Lord that caused this dangerous situation for all those on board. The mariners, however, did not know that Jonah was the cause of this situation. But they did believe that it was someone on board. They believed that someone had offended their God and had caused this storm, which is exactly right. They just didn't know it was the God. Much like in chapter 7 of Joshua, the Israelites knew there was sin in the camp due to Achan's sin at the Battle of Jericho, and these men knew that someone had done something. They decided to cast lots, as was a custom in this time to decide things. Usually this is just a chance decision. However, sometimes the Lord uses it to reveal his will. Let's turn to Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 33. Proverbs 16:33. It says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Also, Matthias was chosen by lots. Can I get a volunteer to read Acts chapter 1, verses 21 through 26? Acts 1, 21 through 26. Mr. Goebel, do you mind reading that one? Oh, sorry. Acts 1, 21 through 26, please.
What verse?
21 through 26.
So one of the men who had accompanied us during all that time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these men must come with us a witness to his resurrection. And they put towards two, Joseph called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, You, Lord, who know the hearts of all, show us which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles.
So God clearly has used lots in the past. And I believe that as evidence here, Jonah was the selected one. That was the cause for the storm. And as soon as this happens, what happens with the rest of the crew? They immediately start hammering him with questions. Who are you? Where did you come from? Which God do you serve? Why have you brought this upon us? Why have you brought yourself here to cause this situation for us? We're innocent here. So in verse 9, Jonah confesses who he is and who his God is. His God is the one who created the sea and the land and who was threatening to destroy their very ship. And he also told them that he was fleeing from God. Well, it doesn't take a smart guy to figure out what happens next. The mariners get very afraid. It says exceedingly afraid. I don't know how many of you have ever been on a boat in rough waters. I have a time or two, and it is not a fun experience. Being tossed about with no control over what happens to you is not a feeling you soon forget. There's an old saying that there's no atheists in foxholes, and I'm willing to bet there wasn't a single one on that boat that day. These men were in grave danger, and it was completely Jonah's fault. Knowing that it was Jonah's fault, and it was Jonah's God that was creating this storm, could have only increased the sailors' fears. So what did they do? What's their next instinct? Okay, now we know it's your fault. What did they do? They did. That was one of the first things they did. But what else did they do? They went and asked Jonah what to do. It was Jonah's God that had caused the storm in their minds. They said, what do we do? Back then, they had different gods that they worshiped. And each one had a different thing that they were the God of in their minds. And so they wanted to know, what God do you worship? And what do we do to appease that God? Because they wanted out. They wanted out of this situation. So they approached Jonah to ask him what to do. It's only logical when you think of it from their perspective. And only Jonah would have known how to appease his God. Now, the Lord could have quieted the storm at any time with just the command. No problem. We see that evidenced in Matthew chapter 8, 23 through 27. When Jesus rebuked the winds and the sea and the storm was still. But I believe Jonah wanted I believe God wanted to use Jonah not only to show Jonah the error of his ways, but also as a future example for us that he might be a forerunner for Christ's story. We read earlier in Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through 40, where Jesus clearly points to Jonah as the sign that if he had just simply quieted the storm, it wouldn't be quite as effective, in my opinion. Jonah did not desire for anyone else to be affected by his decisions and told the men what must be done by throwing him overboard. He was willing to sacrifice himself to save the sailors from the calamity he had brought on them. But Jesus came to calm the storm brought on by those he came to save. Verse 13, the men show reluctance to follow Jonah's command. Jonah said, "Throw me overboard and the storm's going to be calm." But I don't know. Personally, I think if I'm on the ship and Jonah tells me to throw him overboard, I'm probably going to have the same issue they did. I just wouldn't have been able to see how throwing a guy overboard to certain death at this point is going to save me on the ship. I'm probably going to think, Jonah, get on an oar, man. Let's go. So instead of listening to Jonah, they go back to their oars and they redouble their efforts to try and save themselves again. Had they known who they were up against, probably would have saved their energy. They also show their humanity here. Unwilling to throw a man to seemingly his sure death to save themselves at this point in time. But finally, the mariners knew and understood the power of the Lord. They knew that they couldn't escape this on their own. They came to a point where they had to trust Jonah and do what he says. They cried out to the Lord and pleaded that Jonah's blood not be on their hands. This is in direct contrast to what the children of Israel did by telling Pilate that the blood of Jesus be on us and our children in Matthew 27:25. It's also interesting that Jonah went from a person who was sent to save the people of Nineveh to a person in need of saving himself. In casting Jonah overboard, the sailors unconsciously carried out the plan of the Lord. After doing so, the storm calmed, and the mariners feared the Lord and offered sacrifices and made vows. No doubt this was a somber and serious time, as in their minds they had just sacrificed a man to save themselves. Yes, Mr. Dabney.
A big part of the story of Jonah is the issue of compassion. What he's going to learn about it, what God has to teach us about compassion. These other sailors here have shown their compassion for Jonah.
That's right.
Rather than to just pick him up summarily and give him a big toss, there's something kind of solemn going on, I think, about the way he's submitted to the sea, how he's passed over to the sea. Jonah will know that as he goes on in his life. He's going to have that image to reflect on a lot. There's a curiosity in verse 16 when the men feared Jehovah greatly and they offered a sacrifice to Jehovah and made vows. You can wonder who's reporting that. Where's that coming from? Jonah's off the boat. So we have to speculate, how did that information come to us in God's Word? My information so far is going to cause me to say Along the way in Jonah's life, as he reflected back on this whole experience, the Lord passed along to him what went on the ship after he was gone. And there was a glory then to Jehovah God that Jonah had a part in, because he submitted himself to God, submitted himself to these sailors, and provided a way for God to calm the situation for them. It was a great glory for Jehovah God.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, Mr. Wood first.
Yeah, Marshall, you're really bringing out the richness of this chapter, and I appreciate it. It's interesting, if you kind of skip a rock across this chapter, it touches the surface in a couple of places that are very intriguing. So you mention that each one had cried out to his God. So it's almost as though they had a personal God, or perhaps some of them had the same one, but to your point, there's probably some mythology going on in this time and in this part of the world. So that's the first one. And then when those gods didn't answer, they essentially resort to gambling, right? They start flipping coins and casting lots or whatever they did there. So again, very interesting. But then they were exceedingly afraid because when Jonah told them who his God was, it's interesting to me that he had told them about God. But if you go up a few verses from verse 10, it says, "Tell us on whose account the evil has come to you. What's your occupation? Where are you from? What's your country? What people are you from?" So he hadn't really had much of a conversation with them. No. They didn't know anything about him other than he was running from his God. And I found that very interesting, to know that he would tell them something that personal, and yet they knew nothing about him. So this was clearly something that was dominating his thoughts and his actions. Of course, they put two and two together and realized, oh, well, if it's your God that you're running from, then you're the cause of this. What should we do? And he told them to throw him overboard. And then to Dick's comments in verse 16, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So think of the conversion that had happened here, okay, because of these events. In just a few minutes, they'd gone from their pagan gods. And by the way, parenthetically, we could think of our own gods that we turn to before we turn to the Lord, whether that be money or relationships or power or status or whatever it is to try to solve our problems, close parentheses. But they saw the miracle, and I'm wondering that, Jonah didn't want to convert anybody to his God, but he's unwittingly, in a sense, because of this occurrence, brought them to the knowledge of the one true God. Right. And like Dick wants to speculate and be curious about this, I wonder if this changed their lives moving forward. In other words, I wonder if Jonah, the guy that didn't want to convert anybody he didn't like or approve of, is along the way, because of the Lord's guidance, is doing it anyway, right? And you made a good point a moment ago about, him not wanting to save, but ironically, he's now asking the Lord to save him. So, just a few thoughts.
Yes, sir.
In this day and time, most of the Canaanites worshiped a god known as Baal, which we've heard about in the scriptures often in the Old Testament. Baal was the storm god to the Canaanites and the people that worshiped near the people of Israel and Judah. And in that day and time, people believed that things happen for a reason. And so Baal, a storm god, to them, they ascribed it to a deity, the fact that storms came and went, and the difficulty, whether it was more or less, was feared among them, and so that in many ways was a common thought. So throwing him overboard would be quite natural, in my opinion, to the Canaanites. And I'm making an assumption here that the others on the boat were Canaanites, since they had come from the same area that Jonah was in. So the point is that they might more likely have been confirmed, even though this was Jonah's God. They may have been more likely to assume that their God was the one. The way they appeased their God was to sacrifice somebody or someone. Of course, we find that to be anathema to us to do that unless there's some kind of law that says that you do something wrong, then you appear before people and they judge you on the basis of it. This is a judgment of all the souls that are on that boat. It's clear among the prophets of the Old Testament that a few of them, a lot of the books begin with the burden of the word of the Lord came to Malachi, for instance. And the burden of the word of the Lord is that they had something to say. And it was God's word and something to speak. But Jonah didn't have that. Though when he was confronted for his sleeping and his silence, he did confess what he knew in his heart, that it must be God because I know God, he has sent me, and I have refused to do it. I think that's that may be a reach, but he said it's because of me. He certainly confessed that he hadn't done something that the God of all creation, whom the prophets that come from the children of Israel were certainly understood to have the Word of God, and he was not using it. So the thing that he feared the most, that how Nineveh would react to his preaching, he was getting in spades here in terms of the fear that he now possessed and how other people had come to fear it. So his confession is only to answer to those that had a right to ask. You know, you would think that it was probably common that they knew that he was a preacher and a teacher from God. Whether he was a prophet or not, they may not have known, but the Jews were known to worship a God, and the other nations had seen the actions of God and how Judah and Israel were supported by God in the miracles that he brought before his people. Other nations saw those things, and they knew of them, and they feared Israel. So it was logical to ask the one sleeping, because not just because he was sleeping, but because he must know something that the rest of us don't know. So they were willing to believe it. In any case, a lot of things may appear difficult for us to stand, because God was, after all, acting in the presence of men in those centuries before Christ, and we don't see that action as in terms of miracles nowadays. But to them, it would have been, if there's a problem, you do something about it. So, in any case, Jonah understands the situation being attributable to himself, and he fears judgment is coming, one way or the other.
Yes, sir.
I've always been struck by verse 13 and the contrast, and it was kind of hit on a little bit. You have a group of pagans who have a man saying, the way you save yourself is get rid of me. And they have so much compassion, as was mentioned. They row hard to get to the shore. When they realize they can't do it, they say this prayer to God, don't hold this against us, even though Jonah said this is God's doing. And the sad contrast here is Jonah, the man of God, a believer in the true God, sent to save an entire city, and running away from that responsibility because, as we will see in chapter 4, when he has that discussion with God, he knows that God is gracious and that if he goes and preaches, that God will save these people. And I've always been struck by the sadness of that contrast. The pagans who had the true, correct view of the importance of even one life, and the person who's supposed to be the representative of God, who completely discounts the humanity, the importance, the value of this entire city. And so many times when I think about that, I think about myself, how easy it is sometimes to look out and judge the world and say, well, the world is corrupt or wrong in these ways. Do I live up to the standard that I am supposed to uphold and put out to the world? And I think Jonah shows that great contrast.
We're going to have to move on. I was afraid that I was going to not have enough, and now I'm going to run out of time. But in verse 17, after Jonah is thrown into the sea, he's swallowed by a big fish, and he's in his belly for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, there are many who disagree on, is it a fish? Is it a whale? Is it a sea creature? Bible doesn't clearly state, and it's just not essential to our salvation. So for the point of this class, we're going to call it a big fish, or at least I am. You call it what you want. But he's in the belly of the big fish. Like, got about 2 minutes. So now that Jonah's in the belly of the big fish, and we'll start in chapter 2 next week, this in and of itself seems like something impossible, right? How does someone survive in the belly of a big fish like this? But remember in Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, it says, "But Jesus looked up at them and said, 'With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible.'" Without God, Jonah's survival would have been impossible. So what did Jonah do while he was inside the fish? He prayed. You're right. He prayed. And he prayed that and told the Lord of his affliction, and he asked for his aid. This is when Jonah begins his running back to God. And I think we're going to go ahead and end it there for today, and we'll